All right, so we're going to look at setting up the configuration files for Perforce. This is really important, and it's a little bit trickier than GitHub, where a lot of that is done sort of automatically behind the hood. Here we have to be careful that our environment variables are set. If Unreal is just working for you and you're just doing a single project in a single depot, you don't really need to follow this, then everything's fine. But I'm switching between different depots and different Unreal projects, and I find my depots get mixed up and confused, and I have to do a whole bunch of manual setting. So I've come to really rely on the P4 config file, which sort of automates that process for me and makes it easy. I've included a batch file to make this even easier for sort of people who are afraid of command line interfaces. So if you want to just listen to the first part of this video, I'll show you quickly how to set it up, and then I'll dive into a little bit more detail in the second part. So if you're just interested in setting it up, I do have in my GitHub page, and I'll put a link in this video to it, a link to setconfig.bat file. And it is a batch file that will set the configuration. So I can just download this batch file. So I'm going to download it. And then I'm going to go into my download folder. Go into my download folder, which is right here. And I have got, let me see, I've got an old one hanging around here. Let me just grab the new one. And I'll just rename it to what I wanted it to be, which is just setconfig.bat. And essentially, I want to go to properties, and I want to make sure it's unblocked. Basically, it says this file comes from another computer. It's going to give me, do you want to run this batch file? And I'm going to go unblock. I'm not doing anything tricky here. I'm just writing a text file. So I'm going to go unblock, apply, and OK. So I've done that with the setconfig.bat file, and then I can put this in the root of my Perforce directory. So I'm just going to copy it and go to my Perforce directory. So I've just got this test directory here with one file in it, and I am going to put in that batch file. Now it should be at the root folder. So if you have subfolders, it should be at the very top folder. So I'm going to switch to this depot by going to my workspaces and going to test, and I am going to switch to this workspace. Oops, and there we go. And then I've got my setconfig.bat file. So I want it to be in root. So if I do have other folders, it needs to be at the top of the directory because I want this config file to affect the entire directory structure. So I am going to run this file by just double clicking on it. And it should load up here. There we go. So first thing I need to do is enter the server name. So I'm going to enter the server name of our Perforce server. Then ask me for the username. This is the Perforce username. It's not an email address, so it's just the username. There's no @ symbol. And then it wants the name of the workspace. And I am going to go to my Workspaces tab. You can go to View, Workspaces, and then on that workspace, I'm going to double click. It's the test one, and this is the name of my workspace. So I'm going to copy Control-C and Control-V, hit Enter, and then hit Enter again. It says to check that I set all my variables correctly. So I've got my workspace, which in Perforce terms, they also call a client, which is Moby Test Laptop. That's correct. I've got my port, which is the location of my server, and that's correct. I've got my username, and that's correct. And I've also got the char set, which don't really care about at this point. So that all looks good. And essentially what this has done, so I hit enter and it goes away now. And I go, let me go back to let me just hit refresh. It's added a P4 config file. And this P4 config file has these commands in it. And what this means is that every time I am in this directory, it's going to load this config file. So it's going to switch to this configuration. And that really is it. That means when I'm running Unreal, I can run it, and it should have the configuration variables set correctly. In the next video, we'll get into the P4 ignore, and then the following one, we'll look at this in Unreal itself. But that's basically all you need to do. I can dive into a little bit more detail about what's going on here. So I'm going to delete this local file. I'm going to go delete. And then I'm going to go and I'm just going to go into my D drive, into the folder I was in, which the folder was called test. And I'm just going to go P4 set. And basically this wouldn't come up. So this wouldn't come up and at default. So normally this wouldn't even show up. So you have to actually tell it to look for this file. So I'm going to show you what it looks like at the beginning. So I'm going to go P4 set P4 config equals nothing. And then I'm just going to go P4 set. And here we have our client in this case, and the username, which is me, and then the port, but no configuration file, no P4 ignore. So I'll show you what happens if I switch projects. So I go CD backspace and I go to test2, which is a different project entirely. And then I go P4 set. It says it's the same workspace. And test2 is not the same workspace. If I go up here and I switch to test2, the workspace is mobi test2 _alt laptop, not mobi test. So essentially I couldn't write to this folder and Perforce would stop working. So I'd have to manually set these variables themselves. So that really is all that config file is doing. It's setting them for me automatically. Let's do that again, and I'll sort of walk you through what that script is doing. So let's go back. Let's go back to the test. Let's run the batch file again. I'm going to move this down here, close this other window. I'm going to type in the server. My username, my workspace, which I'm going to copy here. And then essentially, I am running a few commands behind the scenes that do a few things. Let's take a look. So this has created that config file. And now let me do a P4 set on that directory now. So I'm going to go back to this directory and open a command window. And I'm going to go P4 set. And you will see now that it's using P4 config. So it's got mobi test laptop. It's set P4 config equals P4 config. So in my batch file, I ran this. I basically said, look for a P4 config file called .p4 config. It can be anywhere on the drive, and it'll load up the one that's closest to where I ran that command from. So it looks for the folder up in the tree that's the closest to it, if it has one, and then it sets it to that folder. So each of my projects has a separate P4 config. And normally the only thing that would change would be my client. Everything else would stay the same. But my client would be different on my different projects. These are the different workspaces. And remember, workspaces are local and the depot is on the server. So it's the workspaces that are local that I have all over my various machines that I use different names for. And the P4 config keeps this straight. The other thing that's very important is if you don't set P4 ignore to .p4 ignore, your P4 ignore file, which we don't have here, and I'll get into this a little bit later, will not work. And that's bad too, because you've got a P4 ignore file, you think it's set up, but Perforce has not set that up. So I'm running two commands in the background. One is setting the P4 config to .p4 config. So essentially in that batch file, all I'm doing is going P4 set P4 config, equals .p4 config. I remember when I put a dot at the beginning with no letters preceding it, it's a hidden file. So you have to make sure you have hidden files turned on in Explorer if you want to see it. I always do on my machine. And then I would go P4 set P4 ignore equals .p4 ignore. So I also put in the script that you've got a P4 ignore file that we name P4 ignore, which is one of the naming conventions. I've seen Perforce recommend using .p4 ignore or P4 ignore.txt. I tend to use the hidden file format, just so that people who don't need to see it don't have to see it. And if you look at our P4 config file again, it has our workspace, our server, our ignore P4 ignore the user, which is in my case always still the same. It's just me, but you could have different users if you were sharing a computer. And then my workspace, which they call P4 client. So that essentially is what it's doing in the background. And if you remember when I went back to test 2, so if I go back and I go cd test 2 and I go P4 set, it's still set on that first file, and it can't find a P4 config. So in this, it's looking through all the files in this directory and below and can't find a P4 config anywhere in this project. So it has nothing to load. So it's got the wrong information. Now I could run that batch file again. I could add it to that project and run it again, but I can just take that P4 config file and edit it. Really all it is this text file. I've already set up all the other environment variables. The P4 ignore will work, as I can see here. The P4 config will work, as I can see here. So I don't have to run the batch file again, but if it's easier for you, go for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste the config file. So I'm going to go here and I am going to open in Explorer. And I'm going to copy this, and then I'm just going to go back to my test2 folder, and I'm going to paste that config file, and then I'm going to edit it. So I don't have to check it out because the source control system doesn't know that it exists, so it's not, it's still writable. I will cover that in a future video. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to put in the new workspace name because it is not mobitest underscore LPT, it's mobitest2 underscore LPT. And I'm going to just double check that. Always a good idea. So I'm going to go to my test2, and I'm pretty sure that's what that is, but I will paste it in just in case. And there, that looks right. So I'm going to close it. And now I'm going to go back to my command line. And then I can go P4 set. And it's reading P4 test 2. So if I go back to my test, cd test, and then I go P4 set, it's on the mobitest laptop workspace. And if I go back to test 2 and I go P4 set, it's on the test 2 laptop. Now, if I didn't do this with a config file, I'd have to manually set P4 client every time I switched programs. That I find is a pain because I'm constantly switching projects. I've got a lot of projects that I'm on, and that just is not something that I want to do. And again, for artists, for other people who don't want to get into the command line world, it's just a lot of work. So this is sort of a one-time setup on this machine, and it should work for a long time on this laptop without me having to worry about this anymore. It sets up my configuration. So again, that's sort of a long way to explain. All you need to do is copy the batch file that is in my GitHub repo that I've got a directory of. You download it, and then you right-click and adjust the properties, run it, answer the questions. The only tough one is the name of the workspace or the name of the client, which you have to double-click. Again, you would go to View, Workspaces, double-click your workspace, and copy and paste this and answer it, and it will run all the commands so that your config is set up, so it loads the config automatically no matter what project you're in. The ignore is set up no matter what project you're in, as long as you call it .p4ignore, and the name of the workspace. So that's it for environment variables. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this helpful. We'll cover the P4 ignore in the next video.